So the road not taken is a lot of critics' choice for probably the most misunderstood poem in American English. It's a very frequently quoted poem, but a poem that usually I think people argue is misquoted rather than accurately depicted. And what I mean by that is most people who read or talk about this poem in public usually do so based on just the last three lines of the poem and sort of ignore everything else. Frost's last famous lines: two roads diverged in the woods, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. In other words, the idea that this poem is an expression of sort of taking the less traveled path, the one that most people in life don't take, by walking to the beat of your own drum, by being your own surface person, and thus in that way, you put your path on for your own success away from sort of the sameness of the crowd, right? And it's a nice message, but I think it's one that's very distinct from what Frost is actually trying to say in this poem. And I think the main aspect that the poem begs us to pay attention to, that people usually disregard, is the way that time is used in what Frost is doing. So if we go back to the beginning of the poem and we think about how time works, it starts in a very sort of conventional narrative sense. And what I mean by that is there is a narrator with us in the present, and the narrator is looking back in the past on a time when he came to this fork in the road and he's walking through the woods and he's got one way to go or the other way to go. This is how narrative literature, usually works in an obvious way. We think back to the past and we tell that story. So Frost's speaker does this. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth, right? So he's in the present, he's looking back at himself in the past. Simple so far, but it gets more complicated. The other thing I'll note here too is it's not just the choice that it's important to him, but it's the absolute feeling that whether he chooses the right path or the wrong path, he is not going to be able to take both, right? I could not travel both and be one traveler. In other words, it's not just the alternatives that are worrying him here. He wants to be able to take both paths at the same time. And so that is the crux of the dilemma. How do you know whether you've made the right choice? How do you deal with the fact that one choice is necessarily going to leave out experience of the other choice? We move on to his choice, and one thing that becomes clear as he describes the two paths, at least in this frame of the story, is he can't tell a difference between them at all. He looked at one, and then the second stanza, then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for the passing there, had worn them, and he admits, really about the same, and both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden back. So that the guy who looks at the paths themselves during the day he's telling the story actually can't tell a difference between how worn one path is from the other. There isn't really a difference. And again, it's not the choice between the two of them that is bothering him. It's the fact that whatever choice he takes, it's going to eliminate the possibility of the other choice. He says at the end of the third stanza, "Oh, I kept the first for another day." So he chooses the second path, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back, right? And the important thing being there that he realizes that, well, if you take one path, you're sort of foreclosing off the possibility of the other path. Even if you make the right decision, you've lost the potential experience, right? That's what choice means. You have to go A and not B. And that's sort of distressing to him. But again, I want to emphasize the degree that at this point, the paths, there is no distinction in how Frost's speaker is viewing them and interpreting them. They're almost exactly the same from his perspective. So then when we get to the last stanza, something has changed. And that change is actually an aspect of time. time here becomes much more complicated at the end of the poem than it was in the initial first three stanzas. So once again, we have Frost's narrator. This time, though, he's imagining himself in the future. I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence, right? So he's looking at himself years from now. And the future self then is thinking back on the same incident in the past at the crossroads that he's thinking back now. So we have present self imagining himself in the future, but the future self that he's imagining is in fact imagining himself back in the past. It's a little confusing, I know, right? But now we have sort of three different versions of Frost's speaker here. We have the present one, a future one, and then a past one imagined by the future, right? Hopefully you're still with me. The memory of the future narrator, however, does not match with the memories of actually the person who is telling the story here now. Remember how the person at the crossroads said, they look worn really much the same. We can't actually distinguish A from B in terms of one being more worn or less worn. They're worn about the same. It's the future self that's actually sort of, you would have to put it this way, lying. Somewhere I will be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I, pause, took the one less traveled, and that has made all the difference. In other words, this thing that everyone points to as sort of the symbolic meaning of the poem is actually Frost admitting he's going to deceive himself in the future. That when he thinks about this some days later on, he's going to think back, and this is the moment in his life where, wow, I did the thing that is less common, and therefore I became great or did something really successful. But what he's telling himself now is that's a lie. That he doesn't know where the other road leads, that he doesn't know the consequences of his choice, but it's important for him to sort of deceive himself in a way that makes him feel better about the choice that he makes. Or at least he imagines a future self who, to justify what he's done, invents aspects of the past that aren't actually true, right? So hopefully maybe you can see some of the reasons I paired the poem and this story together, not just because they're similar time periods, but also they deal with the same theme of how much we don't say or how much we either deceive ourselves and others in the way we tell ourselves things about the decisions we make, the relationships that we have. Okay? I think that's enough for now. Again, please go over, read these carefully. The subject matter we talked about in this mini lecture will be on the quiz that will be available, I'm going to say late the night of October 17th. All right, thank you.